The loud, shrill ring of the doorbell interrupted the quiet afternoon, pulling Jake away from his afternoon coffee and onto the porch. Standing there, with a clipboard in hand and a look of silent judgment, was Officer Lyle, the kind of cop whose presence alone made you feel like you'd done something wrong even if you hadn't. Behind him, in a neatly pressed blouse and pearls, was Mrs. Crawford, the neighbor from 2 houses down, her arms crossed and her gaze cold. Jake had been in this neighborhood for over 5 years now, but it still felt like he wasn't quite accepted. He had worked hard to build his life, owned a small business, cleaned up his finances, and put in the effort to upgrade his home. This pool, one of the last improvements he'd made to the yard, had been carefully planned with safety in mind: an 8-foot fence, a self-locking gate, and reinforced padding for the deck. But Mrs. Crawford had made it clear, in her usual haughty way, that she didn't care about the details. For her, it wasn't about the pool's safety. It was about who was behind it. "Mr. Grayson," Officer Lyle began, his tone clipped, "we've had a complaint about your pool, claiming that it's a violation of safety codes." Jake stood tall, fighting the urge to snap back. "You can see the paperwork." He motioned toward the gate where the certification was hung clearly, just as required by city law. Lyle didn't look at the certificate. Instead, his eyes narrowed, scanning Jake's appearance's working-class jeans and a t-shirt that had seen better days. "You know, I've heard about people like you making shortcuts when it comes to things like this." His eyes flicked to Mrs. Crawford. The unspoken bias hung heavy in the air. Jake felt his blood pressure rise, but he kept his voice calm. "What does that mean exactly?" Mrs. Crawford stepped forward, her lips thin and tight. "I saw it myself, officer. He's been hosting parties out here. Kids running around in the yard, the gate left open. It's a disaster waiting to happen." Jake turned to Mrs. Crawford, disbelief flashing across his face. "That's not true. You've never even come by to check it yourself." The officer wasn't listening to him. His attention was fully on Mrs. Crawford now, the familiar, weary nod of someone who was about to take sides. "I see," Lyle murmured, scribbling something on his clipboard. For a moment, Jake felt the walls closing in. He'd known people like Mrs. Crawford before, people who took pleasure in making others feel small. He hadn't expected much from the officer, but he had hoped that justice, in some form, would prevail. Then the twist came. "You should be aware," Officer Lyle added, his tone shifting slightly, "that Mrs. Crawford has been a frequent concern here in the neighborhood. If you are following all the regulations, there's no need for alarm." Jake's pulse quickened. The officer's change in demeanor was subtle but noticeable. There was something more here than mere code violations. The officer had already made up his mind, and worse, Jake knew this was only the beginning. Jake fought to keep his composure. "I'll show you the rest of the documentation." The officer nodded, but there was a hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of doubt he couldn't quite hide. It was a sign, Jake realized, that this wasn't about rules or safety anymore. It was about something more personal. Jake Grayson had never been one to fit in easily. Raised in a neighborhood on the fringes of the city, he knew what it felt like to be overlooked and underestimated. His parents had worked hard, really hard, but they had always been on the back foot. His father worked as a mechanic, and his mother cleaned offices late into the night. They had taught Jake the value of hard work, but also the bitter truth that the world wasn't always fair. It was a lesson he learned early, when his high school classmates would look down on him for wearing hand-me-down clothes or riding an old bike that barely worked. He knew then that if he wanted to rise above his circumstances, he would have to fight for it. Despite the odds stacked against him, Jake had always been determined to succeed. He put in long hours in high school to make sure he didn't fall behind academically. While most kids played sports or hung out at the mall, Jake worked part-time jobs, saving up to pay for college. It wasn't easy, but it gave him a sense of purpose. In college, Jake studied business and marketing. It felt like a victory that meant more than just the degree itself, which was validation that his hard work had paid off. His first business was a small landscaping company. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. Over the years, Jake managed to grow his company into something more substantial. He diversified into home improvement projects and worked tirelessly to build a solid reputation. He bought his first house, a modest 3-bedroom, in a neighborhood that seemed a little out of reach, but offered a glimpse of what he could have if he just worked hard enough. When Jake bought the house in this upper-middle-class neighborhood, he was thrilled. It wasn't the mansion in the hills that he'd dreamed of, but it was his. His neighbors, however, were less than welcoming. They looked at him with suspicion, as if his presence in the neighborhood was an affront to the pristine lives they had carefully curated. He had gotten used to the sideways glances, the whispered conversations when he passed by. But that didn't stop him from improving his home and creating a space he could be proud of. The pool was his latest project, one that he poured countless hours into. He didn't just want it to be a luxury, he wanted it to be a statement. A way to prove to himself and to everyone else that he could achieve the same. Standards of quality that those born into wealth took for granted. He spent months researching the best materials, hiring the most reputable contractors, and most importantly, ensuring that the pool was built to the highest safety standards. The fence was high enough to prevent accidents, the gates self-locking, and the surface area padded to prevent slipping. Every detail was meticulously planned to make sure it complied with all city regulations. Jake knew how important it was to be compliant with the law, not just for his own peace of mind, but also to avoid any legal pitfalls. Having grown up in a neighborhood where things often slipped through the cracks, where codes were ignored and safety measures were an afterthought, he was determined to do things right. His reputation depended on it. If people saw that he was capable of maintaining a high standard of living while adhering to the law, it would be a victory not just for him but for everyone who had been doubted because of their background. But, despite all the effort he had put into the pool, Mrs. Crawford's complaint had shaken him. The idea that she's someone who barely acknowledged his existence unless she had a complaint would come after him, accusing him of negligence, was infuriating. It felt like everything he had worked for was being questioned. It was one thing to fight the general unfairness of life, but it was another to have someone so personally resentful of his success, someone who refused to see the years of effort it took to build this life. She didn't see the late nights, the missed family dinners, the sacrifices he made to get to this point. All she saw was a neighbor she could scapegoat, someone whose success she couldn't tolerate. Jake's struggle wasn't just with the system, or the lit was with people like Mrs. Crawford, who couldn't accept that someone like him, someone from his background, could rise above the expectations set for him. And yet, every time she stepped into his life, accusing him of cutting corners, he was reminded of how much more there was to prove. It wasn't just about following the rules, it was about making sure no one could ever question his worth again. But this fight with Mrs. Crawford was far from over. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just about his pool, it was about something much bigger. It was about the system that kept people like him from moving forward, no matter how hard they worked in the face of this conflict. Jake had to find a way to stand his ground, to prove that he wasn't just a product of his circumstances, but, as the encounter with Officer Lyle had shown, the world is quick to find new ways to undermine you. The next few days felt like a slow emotion unraveling. Jake could feel the tension hanging in the air, especially as Mrs. Crawford's complaint had now escalated from a simple accusation to a full-on crusade. She had made it clear that she wasn't just concerned about the safety of the pool. She was on a mission to drive him out of the neighborhood. Every interaction with her seemed calculated, each comment dripping with a mixture of superiority and resentment. It wasn't just about the pool anymore. This was personal. Officer Lyle came back, this time with a fire marshal in tow. Mrs. Crawford had called in a second complaint, stating that the safety features Jake had so carefully installed were inadequate. She claimed that the fence was too low, that the gate didn't latch properly, and that the surface of the deck was a hazard. None of it was true, but Mrs. Crawford's words had weight. After all, she had lived in the neighborhood for years and was known to be. In local circles, Mr. Grayson Lyle's voice was stern as he approached Jake for the second time, clipboard in hand. Asterisk, asterisk. This time, the fire marshal was with him, inspecting the area with a critical eye. "You the documents," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Everything is up to code." Lyle glanced at the fire marshal, who nodded as he walked around the pool area, inspecting the gate and fence. Jake's heart began to race. He had been through this already. He had done everything by the book. Yet here they were, questioning his integrity, as if he were hiding something. Mrs. Crawford stood on the other side of the yard. about safety. This was about power, her power over him. And the fact that Officer Lyle seemed to be buying into it only made things worse. "Look, I'm telling you," Jake said, trying to stay calm. "I've complied with everything. You can even check with the city inspector. There's no violation." The fire marshal paused, his clipboard lowered as he inspected the fence again. "I don't see any problems with the gate latch," he muttered, but there was hesitation in his voice. It wasn't a statement of certainty. "The fence seems a little low, but that's not a fire code issue. That's what I've been saying," Jake snapped, the frustration bubbling up. He fought to control his anger. "It's not a fire code issue, it's a safety code issue, and I've followed every regulation." Lyle didn't respond to Jake's outburst. Instead, he turned toward Mrs. Crawford, who now had a triumphant look on her face. "Well," the officer said, his tone shifting slightly, "we'll need to check the rest of the property and make sure everything else is in order. It's routine." But Jake knew this wasn't just a routine check. It was a witch hunt. The way Lyle was leaning toward Mrs. Crawford, the way he listened to her every word with unquestioning attention, made Jake realize just how much influence she had in this neighborhood. It wasn't just about code violations anymore. It was about her personal vendetta, her deep-seated resentment of someone. He had worked so hard to build a life here. He had done everything by the book. Churn, Mrs. Crawford had played the perfect game, making it seem like he was the one in the wrong, and now the authorities were questioning him. Jake's mind started to drift back to the day he bought this house, the pride he felt when he signed the papers. He had come from nothing, and this house, this pool, was the culmination of his sacrifices. Every ounce of effort, every late night, every long day spent building his future felt worthless in the face of this one woman's personal agenda. Then the turning point came. As the fire marshal approached Jake with a few more questions, Jake made a decision. He couldn't just sit back and let Mrs. Crawford win. He needed to take control of the narrative. He had already pulled together his documents, his permits, and his correspondence with the city inspector, his voice no longer wavering. "I have a folder with all the documentations, the inspections, the permits, the compliance reports. I suggest you take a look at them before making any further judgments." Lyle paused, looking at him, then at Mrs. Crawford. For the first time since he had arrived, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But Mrs. Crawford was quick to interject, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I don't think that will be necessary," she said coldly, her eyes narrowing at Jake. "But of course, if you're sure everything is in order, ... Jake's jaw clenched. He wouldn't be intimidated. It was time to fight back, and he was going to make sure the truth came out no matter what days passed. And the situation with Mrs. Crawford didn't seem to be letting up. Each time the authorities showed up at Jake's door, he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. The tension was palpable, and it wasn't just about the pool anymore. It had become clear that the real issue wasn't the fence or the gate tit, was who Jake was, where he came from, and the fact that he had dared to make something of himself in a neighborhood that wasn't supposed to be for people like him. Lyle had stopped by twice more, and each time the interaction felt more like an interrogation than a simple inspection. Jake had presented his paperwork, his permits, and even a copy of the city inspector's written approval. Yet Lyle's eyes seemed to scan him with suspicion every time they spoke, his questions sharp, his demeanor dismissive. It was subtle, but Jake could feel it. Lyle wasn't just doubting his pool's safety, he was doubting Jake's integrity, his right to be in this neighborhood. It wasn't just the officer. The entire system seemed stacked against him. Jake couldn't help but notice the way people looked at him when he walked around the neighborhood. He was a hard-working, self-made man. Yet to them, he was always an outsider, reminder that someone from a background like his could rise, could own a house in their neighborhood, and could make improvements they hadn't even considered. He could feel the sting of every sideways glance. The unspoken assumption that he didn't belong. But it wasn't just the residents. Mrs. Crawford had gotten her claws into the local community, and it showed. People who had once been polite, to Jake, even friendly, now kept their distance. No one said it outright, but he could feel the shift in the air. He wasn't welcome anymore. The more the complaint escalated, the more isolated he became. The tipping point came when Jake was out in his yard one evening, tending to the garden by the pool, when Mrs. Crawford's husband, Alan, walked by with their dog. Alan, always the silent type, made a point of looking away as he passed. But then he stopped short, his gaze lingering on the pool for a moment too long. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "You know, the wife isn't happy about that pool," Alan muttered, as if it was the most normal thing in the world to say. Jake turned to face him, confusion written on his face. "What do you mean? What's she got against it?" Alan shifted uncomfortably. "She doesn't like people like you coming in here, changing things, raising the value of property. Doesn't sit right with her." It wasn't the first time Jake had heard something like that. It wasn't just about the pool. It was about Jake, about his very presence in the neighborhood, and what that represented. To her, and now seemingly to the rest of the community, Jake wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to succeed. Realization stung deep. Jake had always known there was a certain kind of judgment attached to people like him. What was so personal for them was a slap in the face. It wasn't just about a neighbor's complaint. It was about class, race, and the invisible barriers that kept certain people in their place. As if on cue, Officer Lyle pulled into the driveway. Again the next day. This time, Jake was ready. He had everything prepared: the documentation, the photos, the compliance reports. But as Lyle stepped out of his patrol car, Jake saw something in his eyes, a flicker of something familiar, something Jake had encountered far too many times before. It was the look of someone who had already made up their mind, someone who didn't care about the truth because they had already decided who was guilty. "Mr. Grayson," Lyle said, his voice now laced with a condescending tone that made Jake's skin crawl. "We've received more complaints, and frankly, this issue needs to be resolved." Jake's heart sank. More complaints? From who? He already knew the answer, but he needed to hear it out loud. Lyle didn't respond immediately, instead pulling out a notepad and scribbling something down. "Concerns about the way you're managing this property." Jake took a step forward, refusing to let the officer's words slide by. "What exactly are those concerns?" "I've followed every regulation, every requirement." Lyle's gaze hardened. "We've heard enough, Mr. Grayson. Maybe it's best if you just take the pool down before this escalates any further." It was a slap in the face, but Jake didn't. "Back down. I'm not taking down my pool. I've done everything by the book. And if that's not enough for you, then you'll have to explain why you're wasting my time." His voice was firm, no longer apologetic. This wasn't about following the rules anymore. It was about defending his right to be here. In this neighborhood, in this house, he had worked so hard to earn. Lyle hesitated, but the damage had already been done. The officer wasn't here to resolve the situation. He was here to protect a system that kept people like Jake on the outside. And in that moment, Jake realized that no matter how much he followed the rules, no matter how hard he worked, there would always be people like Lyle and Mrs. Crawford, people who would find any reason to keep him out. Jake's resolve solidified. In that instant, he wasn't going to let them win. He would fight for what was his, no matter the cost. The days following Officer Lyle's last visit felt like a blur to Jake. The accusations kept piling up. Just fighting for his pool anymore, he was fighting for his right to be seen as equal, to have the same opportunities as anyone else. Yet, as the tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point, he couldn't help but feel like the walls were closing in on him. Mrs. Crawford had painted him as a careless homeowner, a danger to the community, and it seemed like no one was willing to question her word. But Jake was no fool. He knew something was off. Mrs. Crawford's persistent complaints about his property weren't just about safety concerns. They had to be something more. The woman didn't just want to see the pool gone, she wanted to break him. And in doing so, she was chipping away at everything Jake had worked so hard to build. It didn't make sense, and Jake couldn't help but dig deeper. One evening after another, exhausting interaction with Lyle. Jake sat in his living room, his mind racing. He needed to figure out what was motivating Mrs. Crawford. There had to be more to this than just a neighborly dispute. His thoughts turned to the one person who might know more about her than anyone else, Alan. Her husband, Jake, had always considered Alan to be a passive observer in the neighborhood drama. He rarely said much, and when he did, it was usually in a clipped, uninterested tone, but something about Alan's offhand comment a few days ago lingered in Jake's mind. The way Alan had spoken about Mrs. Crawford's feelings, her dislike for people like Jake, wasn't just casual chatter. It was a clue a crack in the perfect facade Mrs. Crawford had worked so hard to maintain. Determined to get to the bottom of it, he wasn't sure what to expect, but he couldn't shake the feeling that if anyone had insight into what was really going on, it was him. After all, despite his cold demeanor, Alan had lived with Mrs. Crawford for years, the hidden motives that were driving her actions. The next afternoon, Jake found Alan in the front yard, trimming a bush with his back turned. Jake approached cautiously, not wanting to provoke him but also needing answers. "Alan," Jake called. Out, keeping his voice steady, Alan didn't flinch. He put down his shears and turned slowly to face him. "What's going on, Jake?" "I need to ask you something," Jake began, trying to keep the conversation neutral. "It's about your wife." Alan's face hardened for a moment, then softened. "I already told you, Jake. There's not much to say. She doesn't like the way things are changing around here." "I get that," Jake said, swallowing his frustration, "but there's something more to it, isn't there? This isn't just about the pool. She's made it personal, and I want to know why." Alan sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to get involved in this, Jake, but if you really need to know, I'll tell you." Jake waited, the tension in the air thick with unspoken truths. Finally, Alan spoke. "She's always had a problem with people like you," Alan muttered. "People who come in, work hard, and end up with more than she thinks they deserve. She doesn't like seeing someone like you succeed. It makes her feel ... threatened." Jake's chest tightened as the words hit him. It wasn't about his pool. It wasn't even about safety. It was about envy, jealousy, and something darker. Mrs. Crawford wasn't fighting for the neighborhood or for the safety of the community. She was fighting because Jake represented everything she despised: someone who had climbed the ladder and managed to build a life outside of the world she knew. "You've got to be kidding me," Jake whispered, disbelief settling in. "So all of this ... this harassment. It's because I'm successful, because I'm not like her." Alan looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "You don't understand, Jake. She feels like the world is changing too fast. And when she sees someone like you, didn't grow up in the right circles, getting ahead, she feels like it's taking something from her. She can't stand it." Jake's mind was spinning. It was all starting to make sense now. Mrs. Crawford wasn't just trying to get him in trouble with the law. She was trying to erase him. Erase the proof that someone from a background like his could come into her world and make a life for themselves. She couldn't stand the idea that someone like Jake could succeed when she had spent her whole life protecting her position, her wealth, her place in society. "How long has this been going on?" Jake asked, his voice cold now. "Since you moved in," Alan said quietly. "Maybe even before that. She's never liked the idea of change, and she hates the idea of people like you moving in and making things better." Jake stood there, stunned. His hands were clenched into fists, but his mind was racing. He had been right all along. This wasn't about the pool. It was about Mrs. Crawford's inability to accept that the world was changing, that people like Jake could rise above the confines of their circumstances and make something of themselves. It wasn't just jealousy, it was fear. Fear of losing control, of losing the world she had fought so hard to keep in place. Jake's resolve solidified in that moment. He wasn't going to let Mrs. Crawford or anyone else tear down what he had built. Not now, not ever. "I'm going to take care of this," Jake said, his voice steady but filled with determination. Alan didn't say anything in response, but the look in his eyes told Jake everything he needed to know. Alan knew that his wife had crossed a line, and now it was time for Jake to fight back this time. With the truth on his side, Jake's head was spinning with the new information. Mrs. Crawford's personal bias, rooted in her jealousy and need for control, had been the catalyst for everything. It was no longer just about a neighborly dispute or a minor code violation. It was about something far deeper. And with this revelation, Jake knew it was time to confront the situation head-on. If he was going to save his home, his reputation, and his sense of peace, he had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The next day, Jake began to put his plan into motion. He started by gathering every piece of evidence he could find: the city inspection records, the permits, and even the emails from the contractors who had worked on the pool. He even made a few calls to local businesses, confirming that all the materials used were up to code and sourced from reputable suppliers. He had already done everything by the book, but now He needed to ensure that the truth would stand out as clear as day. Free of the distortions Mrs. Crawford had spread. He went through the papers. He thought about the conversations he had with Officer Lyle and how every encounter had been laced with an underlying judgment. It wasn't just the pool that had put him under. Suspicion it was his background, the fact that he wasn't like the other homeowners in the area, and now that bias was threatening to undo everything he had worked for. Jake's phone buzzed. With a message from Alan, it read, "I'm sorry, Jake. I know this has gone too far. You're right to fight back. She's just scared of losing control. But the truth will come out." Jake's hands tightened around the phone. He was glad that Alan had come around, but the situation had already spiraled out of control. Crawford's resentment wasn't just a matter of personal dislike, it was a sign of the systemic issues that people like her perpetuated in neighborhoods like this, where wealth, class, and status created invisible barriers that people like Jake were constantly trying to break through. But now the gloves were off. He wasn't going to let her tear down his life, not when he had worked so hard to get here. Jake decided it was time to confront Officer Lyle one last time. He couldn't let this go on any longer. The officer needed to know the truth, not just about the pool, but about Mrs. Crawford's true motivations. This was no longer just a matter of compliance with the law. It was about the bias that had been at the heart of the entire issue. The confrontation took place the following afternoon. Jake had everything prepared, a folder with every piece of documentation, every email, every report that showed his compliance with the city codes. But more importantly, he had something Mrs. Crawford hadn't counted on: his newfound knowledge of her personal motives. When Officer Lyle pulled into the driveway once again, Jake was ready. This time, Jake was calm, collected, and in control. The officer stepped out of the car, clipboard in hand, ready for another round of questioning. But Jake didn't wait for Lyle to start the usual round of inspections. He walked up to him with a firm step, holding the folder out for Lyle to see. "Officer Lyle, I need to show you something," Jake said, his voice clear and unwavering. Lyle raised an eyebrow but took the folder. "The papers," Jake spoke again, this time not in a defensive tone, but one that was almost clinical, as if he were presenting the facts. "I've followed every rule. I've done everything by the book. The pool is safe. You've seen the reports. You've seen the documentation. But you also need to know why you've been called out here so many times." Lyle looked up from the papers, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean, Mrs. Crawford?" Jake said, holding Lyle's gaze. She's been making these complaints because she doesn't like people like me, people who come into this neighborhood and make something of themselves. She's threatened by the fact that I'm not from her world, that I've managed to succeed without her approval." Lyle's eyes flickered, but he didn't respond right away. Jake continued, his voice gaining strength. "She's been making trouble for me ever since I moved in. And it's not about the pool, it's about her fear of losing control. Her fear that someone like me might prove that she doesn't own this place, that her standards aren't the only ones that matter. She's using you, officer. You've been brought here based on her personal vendetta, not because of a legitimate concern." There was a long silence as Lyle stood there, looking at the folder in his hands. Jake could see that the officer was processing the information, weighing it against what he had been told all along. The officer shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak for a moment. Finally, he looked up at Jake, his face a mixture of frustration and realization. "I had no idea, but I can't deny it makes sense. She's been pushing this too hard." Jake nodded. "I've been telling you the truth all along, officer. I didn't cut any corners. The pool is up to code. But Mrs. Crawford, she's not trying to protect anyone. She's trying to control this neighborhood, and she'll do whatever it takes to make sure people like me stay out." Lyle seemed conflicted, his eyes darting between the folder and Jake. For a moment, it felt like the weight of everything: his biases, his duty, and his responsibility was pressing down on him. "I'm sorry," Lyle said quietly, the words coming slower than Jake expected. "I didn't see it that way. I'll make sure this stops. I'll talk to her." Jake stood still, taking in the officer's words. There was no grand apology, no immediate sense of victory. But there was something deeper, a sense of vindication, of knowing that the truth had finally been acknowledged, even if it had taken longer than it should have. "Thank you," Jake said, his voice steady. "But it's not just about stopping the complaints. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. People like Mrs. Crawford don't get to control the narrative anymore. Lyle gave a short nod. I'll make sure this is the last time you're bothered. As the officer left, Jake watched him go, feeling a strange sense of relief mixed with something else and understanding that the battle wasn't over. But for the first time, the truth had been given a voice. It wasn't just about the pool. Anymore, it was about the quiet injustices that so many people like him had faced, and the courage it took to stand up and fight back. The days following Officer Lyle's reluctant admission were strangely quiet. The phone calls, the complaints, and the constant tension in the neighborhood seemed to stop. It was as if a dark cloud had lifted. But Jake knew it wasn't just the end of the drama. It was a moment of change, one that he hoped would resonate beyond his own property. Mrs. Crawford had backed off, but Jake wasn't sure if she would ever truly let go of the animosity that had driven her to such extremes. In the end, it wasn't just her behavior that had to change, was the larger narrative she represented, one where people like him were always treated as outsiders, no matter how hard they worked. As the weeks went on, life began to return. Too normal, but it wasn't the same. The interactions Jake had with his neighbors, though cordial, felt distant. It wasn't that they didn't respect him. Now they did, at least outwardly, but the tension that had simmered beneath the surface for so long hadn't fully dissipated. The truth had been laid bare, but the damage of prejudice wasn't easily erased. Jake spent more time in his yard, tending to the pool that had once been a symbol of his hard-earned success, but now seemed like a reminder of the battle he'd fought. It wasn't about the pool anymore. It was about the way he had been judged, not for the work he had put in, but for the life he had chosen to build. He thought often about the way Officer Lyle had looked at him in the end, his eyes reflecting doubt and remorse. Jake had seen something, there a flicker of realization that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong about Jake all along. The conversations with Alan, Mrs. Crawford's husband, had continued sporadically after that day. Alan had sent a few apologetic messages, but Jake didn't fully trust them. There was something passive in Alan's nature that made it hard to take his words seriously. He had never been the one to take a stand, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was just as complicit in the way things had played out. Still, Jake appreciated the fact that Alan had offered some insight into his wife's motivations, even if it had been too little, too late. The turning point came when Mrs. Crawford unexpectedly knocked on Jake's door one afternoon. She looked different, less confident than the last time he'd seen her, her posture rigid, her eyes avoiding his. Jake wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew it wouldn't be an apology. People like Mrs. Crawford didn't apologize, just moved on, pretending as if nothing had happened. I've come to apologize, she said, her voice flat and lacking the conviction Jake had expected. I didn't realize how far I'd gone. I was wrong about you, Mr. Grayson. Jake studied her carefully, waiting for the words to sink in. What made you realize that? He asked, his voice guarded. The years of resentment he had built up for her weren't easily wiped away. I don't know, she said, shrugging slightly. Maybe it's because it's all gone too far. And maybe because you've shown me that not everyone is trying to take something from me. I've spent so long trying to protect what I have that I never really saw people for who they are. It was a weak apology, but it was still something. Jake didn't know whether to feel satisfied or resentful. In a way, Mrs. Crawford's apology was a hollow victory, a reminder that sometimes people only see the truth when they're forced to confront it. But the one thing he knew for sure was that the battle wasn't really about her, had never been. It had always been about the system, about the biases that were so deeply ingrained in people like her, and how those biases affected people like him. Thank you, Jake said, his voice surprisingly steady, but I won't forget what happened. You made a choice, and that choice affected my life. I don't know if we'll ever be friends, but I don't hold grudges. Just remember, people like me don't need to prove anything to you. We've always been good enough. Mrs. Crawford looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, her expression unreadable. I'll leave you alone now, she said quietly, before turning to walk away. Jake watched her go, feeling a mix of emotions. There was no great resolution, no sense of triumph, just a weary acceptance of the way things were. As Jake stood on his porch, watching Mrs. Crawford disappear down the street, he realized that the victory wasn't in winning the fight, it was in surviving it. He had fought back against the prejudice that had been directed at him, not with anger or retaliation, but with the truth. He had proven to himself, and to others, that no matter what the world tried to say about him, he had a right to be here, to live the life he had worked so hard to build. Jake didn't need Mrs. Crawford's approval. He had already earned his place in this neighborhood, and while things might never be perfect, he knew one thing for sure. The next time someone tried to judge him based on where he came from, or who they thought he was, he would be ready to stand his ground, because in the end, the truth always wins. It wasn't just about the pool, it was about the way people saw him. It was about refusing to let anyone define him by the limits they tried to place on him. And no matter what happened next, Jake would continue to build, continue to rise above the narrow views of those who would rather see him fail, because he knew that he had already won the most important battle. He had fought for himself, and that was something no one could take away.